Welcome to the latest edition, I suppose, of the podcast. I'm here today with John Waters. Hardly needs an introduction, but I'll give him a short one. We'll go a little bit into your background, John, in a minute, but obviously you're one of Ireland's best-known journalists, have been for decades. You've come through Hot Press, McGill, played an important role in getting that off the ground. You were a long-time columnist with the Irish Times, wrote multiple, I'd say, iconic books at this stage. And what we have you here today for is to talk about your latest one, The Abolition of Reality. John, you'll have to forgive me. It only came this week, and you'll forgive me for not having read the whole thing.
I forgive everybody. I have issued a general dispensation, an absolution that you have 18 months.
That's fair. It's an absolute beast. But I mean, God bless your stamina. My gosh, 641 pages. But it's I have had a chance to scan it, John, and so for what I've seen is that it seems to be part diary, almost like personal journal, part political analyses. You're winding in a lot of influences, I think, on your what formed you politically and the many thinkers.
Well, yes, but thinkers that were very germane to what was happening at the time, because really the book goes, I think, I would say, deeper. It's not a factual history of the period. It's not a chronology of events. What it is obviously there's a chronology in it, but it's almost like a chronology of meaning and getting to what's going on underneath these things. So it's about things like propaganda and group and all of these kind of things that and money, and the meaning of money and in the end chapter, which is the longest chapter, it's about the idea of play, which I believe was weaponized. The instinct of humanity for play, to play from childhood. That they actually cunningly tapped into that and created a kind of a very dark satanic game, which you were forced into and required to play, which had completely arcane and absurd rules, but we had to obey them. And this was like a kind of a burlesquing of the human race, really, I think. So we can get into that in a while, but it's a not book, but it is, you're right. It was like a journal. It was my journal. I started to write.
It felt personal, yeah, from what I've scanned through.
Well, there are some parts of it that are written in a personal way, but each theme I took, it was kind of when it rose in my mind and in reality, and I tried to kind of, I wrote these articles for my Substacks going back to 2020, and when I went through them, then I realized that there was a kind of a unity about them.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to above all, I wanted to put it into a book form, because I don't really have any faith in, we're told that anything that's on the internet is there forever. That isn't true.
No.
I would say anything that's in a book has a better chance of being there forever.
I absolutely agree. That that's one thing that anyone who's buying this, and this would be the reason I would recommend anyone buying it, is that exactly as you said, John, that we talk a lot about, when the history books are written. Well, I think more and more they aren't being written, or they won't be written.
Yeah.
This, I think it's not going to steer you wrong. I think it was essential that somebody took the time to wade through the madness of those couple of years, and not just the years, but what's happened since and their impact on politics since then. John, so it was written as this unfolded. So the Substack was essentially your diary. So it was a series of observations that you put together. Was it so as it went, or was it a retrospective here?
It was as it went. The pieces are not particularly altered, apart from two, which I slightly developed at the end because I wanted to create an ending for the book, and I wanted to adjust them in that way and put more into the articles than I had, including the one about play, which is quite a long article, quite a long chapter. But I wanted that very much idea that I would leave something I'm not in any way morbid about my chances of surviving any longer. I don't know. I'm actually about the same age as the new Pope, and he's looking to go for 20 years. So,
you still got a 6 in front of the number, so you're all right. You're not officially old yet.
Just about there. But I wanted above all to have that, sense of, you see, because as you say, I had really come to the view that they're in the course of eliminating history.
Yeah.
In any meaningful sense. I mean, they're fabricating history. They're fabricating literature now. I've written about that, not in this book now, but I've written about it in other, that novelists are now writing novels to order in order to create a false version of reality. That's how bad things have got. And the history books will be written in the same way. In fact, I have talked about that a fair bit. It's a strange thing. I mean, that's the big book. But it's only about 10% of the amount of stuff I've done in the last 5 years. So there could be another dozen books in there if I survive long enough to get them out. But I do want to get them out. This to me is the most important thing that's happened in the whole of human history. Certainly in my history, in the history of my lifetime. And I kind of feel that it's the reason I'm here. And it's the reason for everything that's come before, that was just kind of apprenticeship to come to this point and be this kind of, I don't know what you would call me, an evangelist of these terrible times. And that's kind of what I want to do, to explain to them and to explain. I've often said, and it's in the blurb on the back, I quote Winston Smith from 1984, Orwell's main character. Right. And when he's doing his diary, he starts his diary, if people remember, that where he got this alcove in his flat, out of sight of the telescreen, as he thought. Right. And he had a beautiful new notebook when he was starting off, and he said, well, who am I writing for? He was to himself, rhetorically, and he's decided for the future, for the unborn. And that's kind of how I feel about this book, because I think, that's why I say, it would be nice if people read it, but if they only buy it and leave it for their grandchildren, secreted somewhere around the house, up in the attic, under the rafters, somewhere like that, where it will be intact, and in 30, 40, 100 years, somebody will take it out and read it. They will have some sense of what happened, and what happened to our beautiful country and our beautiful civilization if this continues. The subtitle is A First Draft of the End of History. Right. And that's a kind of a provocative and contingent title. It's a first draft in the sense that all journalism is a first draft of history. But I'm leaving it open. The second draft might be better. The final draft might be wonderful. But I want to tell people this is where we are now. We're at the crisis point. We're at sure, it could be these things, but right now is the crucial moment. Good. It's not looking good, and we need to do something. We need to galvanize. We need to get our ideas straightened out. We need to stop the infighting in the movement, the freedom movement. We need to do all these things, but we need above all to be clear in our heads that this is a really serious attack. That there is a war against humanity going on. It's the spiritual war at its most fundamental level. But it's a war against everything, mental, physical, spiritual, psychological, every level of the human, moral, etc. That's the level. That's what. It resonated with me, that title. I don't know if you know, but I was a history teacher for a good while. I studied history and archaeology, but it was the subtitle which I really, it struck me. A first draft of the end of history, and you and I. And everyone at this point knows just how corrupted the media has become, especially in Ireland, where it is just an arm of the government at this point. It's a propaganda wing of the government, and that's not being histrionic to say that. I mean, no. You can prove that. Just by looking at the journalist to advisor pipeline, looking at the funding of the media. There isn't a single conglomerate in Ireland that can exist on its own 2 feet without government intervention, financial intervention, and so on. But it's beyond that. What really struck me, it was around the time they were tearing down all the monuments, just as the
the COVID struck, and I was struck by the fact that no historians, and even historians that I would have had time for, were standing up and saying, "Stop this madness! Stop this the tearing down of the past, disappearing the past, reinterpreting the past, this revisionism of the past." But most importantly, and I think what to me underpinned everything that happened in the COVID period, it was forcing people into this black and white situation that we don't trust you to make up your own mind about anything. We're going to tell you how it is. And people all came down overwhelmingly on one side, no matter what the issue was, be it Black Lives Matter, be it COVID, be it whatever, we could say a globalist side, that a lot of people, historians, people who should have stood up and said stop, who should have stood up and said no. I think you and I are jaded enough to know that journalists weren't going to do it, but then I saw it in these other faculties as well, and I realized just how deep the rot was. So I think that's why a book like this is essential, as you say, as a hard copy in your hand, something that cannot be manipulated online, something that cannot be disappeared online.
That's right, but I would tell people, don't feel that it's a dry kind of account of things they already know.
It's not. No.
There's many dimensions to it, but the point you make is very clear and very good. And that struck me about everything, under every heading, and that was, to me, I'm still astounded by that. The way that all of the so-called, the good men and true and the good women and true, that you would have expected to step forward and say, "Hang on a minute. What's going on here? You can't do this. This is not possible. We have a constitution, we have charters, we have conventions, we have all kinds of things which guarantee us the right to leave our houses when we like."
Yeah.
Right? And nobody did. And that, to me, was astonishing. I don't know how it was that I was shocked by this and almost nobody else seemed to be, or in general, that when you looked around, for the kind of voices you expected to hear were silent.
Yeah, those in positions of power.
Yes, but even people who say had been in power before, who had made grand statements and espoused huge philosophies of freedom and liberty and equality and decency and all these things, silence from everybody. And you say to journalists, well, you see, I was actually shocked that journalism didn't, because I came through all that place in various kind of magazines and RTE. I was in RTE for a while.
Sure.
I was in the Irish Times. I worked in the Independent. I was at lots and lots of editorial meetings and all kinds of meetings about stories and whatnot. I was on the Broadcasting Commission, and we looked into, investigated, how journalism was conducted or not, and these things were taken very seriously. And I mean, I heard a lot of rhetoric in that time, and I remember those meetings, like in the Irish Times, where the room would be full on the weekly meeting, for example, the features meeting, which was a general meeting about the content of the paper for the next week, and there would be various ideas being thrown out. And there would be people all over the room who weren't involved in the particular area. It might be, sport, or it could be, arts, and there would be a cross-pollination of opinion. And people would be popping up who had no particular input into that particular aspect of the paper, but who would have strong opinions. And they'd say, "Come on, you can't do that. This is ridiculous." Or, "Yeah, that's a good idea, but why not try it this way?" And this was the
how it should be. How it should be.
Newspaper, yeah. And I just thought, this is going to be gone in 3 days. They're going to laugh this off the face of the earth. One editorial in the Irish Times will put an end to this, but it didn't happen because they were bought. And that's the thing. This is the shocking thing, Owen. When myself and Jim O'Doherty took our case to the High Court, to realize that actually the media, not alone were they not there to report what was happening, in other words, to find out what our case was, they were there to attack us, and for no other reason. I mean, there was an RTE reporter who followed me from the street up the steps into the court building with a microphone and a cameraman, screaming at me, "Is it a hoax? Is it a hoax? Is it a hoax? Is it a hoax?" This was her journalism. The national broadcaster Instead of saying, what is your position? What
Right.
is your concern? Why are you coming to the court? Can you explain? No, that day was over.
When did this change, John? Because let me take you back so for a sec, and after this, let's go through some of the big points that you've made that you think so are crucial. What are the things that have changed in politics, society because of what happened? But before then, as you said, you've come through. You've done it all in Irish journalism, you know. But when did it change? When did editors or owners decide that it's much easier just to go along than to have this multitude of voices, which is essential for any democracy to function?
I actually honestly don't think that moment arrived until the spring of 2020, but there was a preparatory period in which other things happened.
Okay.
And a critical thing was the arrival of Twitter and the fact that, well, first of all, there was the fact that the economic model of the newspaper industry was collapsing because they were giving their product away for nothing. And, you know, platforms like Facebook and so on were getting this product and putting it out.
Right.
And they were basically pulling in not just the audience, but the advertising as well.
Right.
And that was really undermining. So the newspapers essentially had committed to Harry Carey, you know, and there was no kind of way back for them once they'd done that, because they couldn't about turn, you know. And so that was one thing. Then the second thing that happened was that as a reaction to that, when Twitter came on board, the whole role of journalists changed. That journalists no longer were. I mean, when I was starting the Irish Times, like, it was a very proper place, like Pulp.
Oh yeah.
Like I actually had short hair for the first 6 months when I was in the Irish Times. I look at photographs, man, I can't believe it, but I actually got my hair cut and I wore a tie. Like, if I was going out to interview Mary Robinson or somebody, I would wear a shirt and tie and a suit. Right. You know, right. I can't believe I did now, but I did. And that was because there was a certain gravitas. Now, you might call it a humbug, but, you know, it was that the Irish Times was a newspaper of record. The Irish newspaper of record was a venerable newspaper, 150 years old and so on, and a great tradition of reporting and so on.
I say it all the time. It used to be, they could rightly claim to be the paper of record. They could rightly, all through university in my time, it was a prestigious publication.
And it wasn't just the Irish Times. I remember actually, you know, McGill, when I was working there as editor, you know, and Vincent Brown had very clear ideas. And, you know, sometimes he was a publisher and sometimes we would have meetings and there would be some article which he was sniffy about, you know, that he didn't like the tone of. And I says, what's your problem with it? He says, it's not that kind of magazine. That's all he would say. It's not that kind of magazine. I would know what he meant. It's a question of tone.
Right.
And then that same thing. Now, you see, like, when I was a columnist at the Irish Times, you're free in a certain thing. You're free. There's a lot of exaggeration of the extent to which people were censored. I was never really censored except on a couple of subjects. Family law was a big one, and that kind of issue. You know, it was almost impossible to get anything in, and the pretext always was the law, legal, you know, the in-camera rule or something. But that was actually a pretext.
Why was it that you would be annoying certain higher ups or what? Why was it so?
I now realize actually that what was going on in the family courts was a kind of pilot scheme for what's happened since 2020. That was a way of invading the family, of breaking down the family, of humiliating fathers, of brutalizing fathers, of alienating parents from children, and so on, and driving wedges between parents instead of trying to.
I remember, John, you got an awful amount of heat. Like, you were Ireland's first father's rights campaigner. I think it's fair to say, right? And but I remember you got savage pushback, though. I remember even then by and you know, that wasn't typical of the time. You know, there were tamer times in many ways. But you know, there was a certain fire behind that, and there was a certain anger in. Why was that?
Well, okay. By the way, I wouldn't have been the first. I was the first and most visible, I think, early on. But there
Okay.
was a fellow called Limo Gogon who was there before me. He started a parental equality, an organisation dealing with this. But yeah, to deal with that question, you see, I only retrospectively realised that I was over a target, but I didn't know what the target was. And I thought it was basically prejudice against men. But it wasn't. It was much, much deeper than that. It was, as I say, a profound attack on the family. The family, you see, because for where we're going now, where the state is supreme, the family has got to be obliterated. And so everything you're seeing, and looking back now in the rear view mirrors, at the 90s, the 80s, 70s, 60s even, feminism, third, phase feminism, or whatever it's called, the LGBT thing, the attacks on fathers, the family courts, all of these were part of an instrumentalization of the state bureaucracy and state coercion in what are supposed to be civil courts, which are supposed to be courts ostensibly set up to reconcile differences between parties, but in fact were quasi-criminal courts. Because what happened, generally the father was criminalized. He was like he was some kind of
was removed from the family unit.
Removed from the family unit. I mean, the appalling stories like where a father would be jailed for sending a birthday card to one of his children or something like that. All that kind of stuff was passing my desk every day of the week.
Really?
I was trying to write about it, but I ran into huge problems all the time. And I didn't realize it at the time. But there now, in retrospect, I realized there was a totally disproportionate rage against me on account of that. It was because I was actually taking on something that was hugely important to the agenda, and I didn't realize that. I thought that it was simply something that needed to be straightened out. It was almost like that once I announced
it, you thought you could fix it, this one little thing in the system.
Yeah,
and it was the whole system.
And to this day, I'm baffled. I to some extent, there's a part of me that's still baffled when I see like the way that politicians behave towards me, patronizing me. I mean, I could give you a list of half a dozen politicians off the top of my head who wasted my time pretending that they were interested in fixing this.
Really?
Oh yeah, like people like Enda Kenny and all these guys, like they would make a big show of saying, "Oh yeah, you're very interesting, John, what you're saying." And Brian Lenihan, the late Brian Lenihan, now he was a decent guy, but he still did nothing. He was expressed interest. He said, "Keep going, John. You're doing a great job." But nobody did anything. And here we are now. We've got the greatest gay marriage in the planet, but fathers are still being brutalized in family courts. And we have parental rights for gay couples. And we have in vitro, and we have all kinds of protections. But we still have no protection for a father and a child. And I mean, I was somebody who had to rear my child in that situation, fighting for my life and her life. And against the bureaucracies of two states, Ireland and England and Wales. And it was horrendous for several years. But these people then, they still haven't done it. They still haven't fixed it. They're not interested in fixing it. So you see, this is the thing. When I went into this first, I thought, Owen, that it was like, because I came from a kind of slightly wishy-washy lefty kind of position. When I was in Hot Press, I was very wishy-washy lefty, And I kind of thought, and it was all feminism and, all this sort of stuff when we were young fellas, And then I thought, I stumbled on this. And I thought, being a journalist, you think journalists are always looking for a story, a big story. Yeah. And I thought, wow, this is a big story. Wait till my compadres get to hear about this. They're going to be really interested in this. What? This injustice, this kind of
social justice, yep.
Oh yeah, they're going to go mad when they hear this. They did go mad, right, against me. They started kicking the head off me. And I thought,
so again, totally isolated amongst your peers even.
Yeah, I said, that's very interesting, isn't it? That they're not interested in fixing this particular social injustice. It's only the other kinds, So there was an ideological. Then they thought, well, that's ideological. It actually wasn't. They were really responding to some kind of directives that were being filtered through. by way of that there was an official policy to do this to families and to do this to fathers, to isolate fathers, to remove them from it. Like if you look at what happened in relation to social welfare and single fathers, and where essentially the system of social welfare was constructed to constructively banish the father from the family. So there would be no possibility of the mother and father living together, because if they did, the mother would have lost out on benefits. And there was lots and lots of cases. I mean, my wife used to be in the Vincent de Paul, and she would tell me, she would go to visit houses, and they'd be giving out money and so on, and at a certain point, she'd be realized that the husband was out on the balcony, or not the husband, the man, the father was out waiting for her to leave. This was Ireland, progressive Ireland in the making.
Yeah.
This is the kind of stuff that was really going on behind the veneer of we're so compassionate, we're so caring, we're so progressive, we're so tolerant.
Yes.
No, there was an agenda to destroy the family, and that was central to.
What's that then, though? If there's an agenda there that speaks to this. If it goes back that far, then it has to be one of two things. It has to be that there was a extreme progressive liberal takeover, say, of government and the various organs of state from a very early on, or there is some external influence, maybe via the EU or whatever, that we are seeing now really coming down on our necks. But where do you think that came from? That
I think it was both things, Owen.
Where we find ourselves now, what started there? Do you think that there is an ongoing project?
I believe that the models of progressivism and liberalism we got were constructed precisely for this purpose, and they were fed into the system through academia and the media and so on, in order to achieve these things.
How early would you say, John? 70s is when I would see a lot of this, the heavy Marxist stuff infiltrating the university systems. Late 60s.
Yeah, well, I guess it did. I mean, I only have anecdotal evidence of that because I never went to university. But I became aware of it coming out of those places, And
you would have seen it in your colleagues, of course.
Yeah, when I was in the Irish Times, I noticed it. But certainly I only joined the Irish Times in 1990. But from then, it was very clear that within, say, the Department of Education, there was a determined attempt to do something radical that wasn't good. I remember actually there was a program brought in for transition year boys, which was really feminism. Which basically the book was we fought it and we eventually got it taken off. It was really the most poisonous thing.
How early was that, John? Roughly.
That was actually, I think, that was late, actually. That would be late 90s or even 2000 type of thing,
Yeah, but that's early by considering now where we are.
Yeah, but I think this thing had been going on for a long time, but nobody really understood.
It's attack on boys, yeah.
Yeah. And also things like the attack on the syllabus. I remember one time there, maybe around the same time, there was this basically reform of the English syllabus, the Leaving Cert syllabus, and all the great writers like Dickens and those guys were taken off and they were replaced by South American lesbians, or the likes,
right.
Right. Like that kind of stuff was all the time. And I remember a time,
it's true. I'm laughing, but it's true.
But it was extraordinary. I remember one time. I used to write about all aspects of as this thing opened up in front of me. I started off writing about family court, and then I started writing about male suicide, which was at the time gone through the roof. It was 10 to 1 males on females. It was really shocking, and mostly young men, and nobody seemed to care. And it just struck me, if this was the other way around, everybody would be going crazy. They would stop the clock, until they fixed it. And all this sort of stuff. But I remember actually, I do all kinds of articles, about men's health and so on. And I was constantly getting into trouble and being the editor, saying, the women are after you, the women want your head in a plate, and all this sort of stuff. But I remember one article I wrote about, I think it was Lyons' tea, brought out a new kind of a triangular tea bag. And they had an ad on TV, which is one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. And like, they just the way, because it was a man who couldn't understand the principle behind the tea bag, you know. So the wife explained it to him, you know, in simple language, and then she boiled the kettle and made the tea as well. You see, do you get it? So like, not alone was she, you know, she's 10 times smarter, but she's actually useful, whereas he's a useless. Right.
But
now,
John, I wonder though, I've often thought, and I've said to many people, and you see, for people outside of Ireland, and especially the big industrial nations, it's very difficult for them to understand. But you know, because we were pastoral so late, I believe that Ireland has, at least when I was young, it seemed to me to be a matriarchy. Now, if you look at sure, the jobs or whatever, the economic, there's that element, but in terms of social mores, in terms of like what you're talking about there with family court, it's a given that the mother will always have the child. What you're talking about this, that there's certain givens that, like you say, you can go the opposite direction. You can attack a man on this, and this, but you can't touch the Irish woman, because that's seen as that's off limits. And I think it's because in every other way bar this economic, and that's gone now, I would say, that Ireland is a matriarchy.
I've always said that. I said that Ireland was a matriarchy disguised as a patriarchy.
Yeah, I think so.
The rhetoric said patriarchy, but there was no evidence of it when you started.
Right.
And that goes back actually to the post-famine period and the devotional revolution, in my view, that happened. If you remember, what was the Archbishop that came in? Paul Cullen. Came in 1850, I think, and he started this devotion revolution. And the logic behind it was to try, because the belief was that the catastrophe that had occurred in the 1840s was down to the fact that the population had exploded in the previous century, and that basically the situation was that the population had become too dissolute, and you know that the morals had kind of gone, and you know, family breakdown. There was kind of like a different, very much common, you know, a mother would have several children by different men, and the head of the household would be her brother, not one of the husband or the fathers or whatever. And it was all that kind of stuff. And this was an attempt to clamp down on that. And what was come up with was really what you would call a kind of a partnership between the mother and the priest, or the priest and the mother. It's a chicken and egg situation, because she was then, the clampers are put on her as a kind of a moral guardian within the family.
Right.
And as a result of that, that she worked. The father was marginalized. Basically, he was driven out to his fields or behind.
That's right. Exactly right.
And so the Irish mammy became like the force for virtually everything, like everything that was important.
Exactly right.
The rearing of children, the education of children, all these things were. Now, of course, the priest was a man, but here's the interesting thing: the mother chose the next generation of priests. She picked from her own brood the most suitable guy to be the priest, and that's a very interesting thing. And a very interesting kind of collateral aspect of that is there was a crisis in Irish life, demographic crisis in the 40s and 50s, which really came to notice in America in particular. And it was because few couples were getting married, and so few couples were having children, and that their population was now in decline. Now, it is nothing compared to the decline that we're facing now, and nobody talks about it. But it was still at the time regarded as very serious. And what they noticed was, in Irish America, what they noticed in the research they were doing there was that families which had a priest or a nun were more prone to this tendency than others. In other words, that the elevation of virginity or of chastity was such that it caused couples not to want to get married or not to have sex or whatever. Now, there was many aspects of that, because they did away with dances, and there was a huge kind of almost like great reset of Ireland after the famine culturally.
I think anyone though who knows an
famine euphemistically, of course, it was a genocide. Of course it was. But just for the avoidance of doubt,
Sure.
no doubt about that. But loosely calling it famine, there was famine, as in famine in the sense that Pierce meant when he was talking about it. Was it in The Murder Machine, where he says, that when the English start a famine in one of their dependencies, they never do it for fun. And a brilliant opening sentence. And so this was a very, very strange period where, like in the churches, like the men were on one side, the women were on the other. And if a man and a woman were seen after Mass hanging out together or talking, as they would have called it then, they'd be named, they'd be read from the altar, for company keeping.
Yeah.
So there was like a tyrannical imposition. This is something, like in many ways, I've many times in many contexts defended the church from all kinds of charges. Maybe a little bit too much, but that's another day's work. But this is something that isn't very often talked about. The extent to which this was it started off with, you might say, good intentions to kind of stop the population growing out of control. It was hugely successful at that, but it destroyed the culture of society. And I think if you actually look at graphs now, going back to the 1840s, that's a very interesting thing to do, because what you actually see overall is in terms of population, of fertility, it's a line that's going down at a kind of 45-degree angle, right? More or less. There's a spike in the 70s, not much longer, which begins to go out then. And apart from that, the trajectory of the line downwards is the same to the present. In other words, the spike came and went, and then it continued on the path it had been. And this is, it seems to me, the unspoken tragedy and calamity and catastrophe of Irish history. That in the wake of the genocide famines, it was only starting. That was only the start of it. There were subsequent famines and understated.
That's right. There was other smaller ones before and after. Yeah.
But vast numbers of people left, and untold numbers. Nobody can tell you how many people. People throw out figures like 2 million. I think it's much, much more than that.
It's a great book called The End of Hidden Ireland, and it talks about exactly that point, that there was absolutely no accurate record keeping out in the West. It just wasn't possible. That you had villages that were completely, you couldn't see them. They're just because they were built into little sod cabins built into the edges of riverbanks. There is no accurate record keeping.
But to clarify the point that we started off with there, what the matriarchy, it was a kind of a qualified matriarchy in the sense that the church was the ultimate authority over womanhood, over motherhood, and used her as a proxy in the family.
Right.
Now, the mothers in turn then, as I say, the next generation of priests. So it's chicken and egg, as I say. But nevertheless, that was the power structure. The church was on top, the mother, but the father was basically debased. He had no place in the life of his family, really, other than as a kind of breadwinner and, an authority in, a kind of a dean of punishment, perhaps. He
would mete out the punishments for the mother.
Therefore it was easy for the courts. This is one of the things I came up in my general reporting about courts, because it was in talking to people about it, that the courts were able to rely on this prejudice that fathers really had no role to play in marriage.
Right.
Like I told some horrific stories, of people, men who had gone to the very furthest extreme to protect their children, being absolutely brutalized, and the children being thrown back into absolute calamity by judges who, and I used to say this to men, I say, be careful when you speak to judges, particularly to male judges, because if you stand before a judge and say, Judge, I'm a father, and I'm not bad at it, and I love my children, and I can look after them, and I'm able to change a nappy and cook a chicken, and I don't see why I shouldn't be entitled to an equal standing with the mother. The judge is going to be sitting there in his bench, and he's going to be thinking to himself, well, yeah, look at this fucker here now, but I've done none of this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
And so either there's something wrong with him or there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the judge, so I decide who there's something wrong with. And that's the way it worked.
I would recommend to anybody to go back. Everybody hates the Blaskett biographies, of course. We were all tortured by Peg, but I would recommend that anyone goes back and rereads them now at this later stage in your life, because you realize very clearly just how late a medieval form of life that had long disappeared elsewhere in Europe survived in Ireland. And, just while everything you're talking about, when industrialization came to Britain, France, Germany, America, it brought with it all these new dynamics and whatnot. But as you said, until very, very late, and up until the 60s and 70s, we had that traditional dynamic of the man went out to the fields in huge swathes of the country, that the man went out into the fields, that was his domain, and the woman stayed at home, that was her domain. The social, it wasn't, they like to trivialize it now and make out like the woman was a slave. Far from it. The man and the woman were equal partners, and they had their domains, and they were both the masters of their domain. But she had control over everything you said, the social, and by extension, then the political and everything else that follows.
Right. That's right. And another thing...
But it was very late. And that's where I think that this prejudice in favour of the woman and this, I do think that's why Ireland remains a matriarchy, because we've lost our connection to the land. We've lost farming and industrialisation. The man lost his domain, but the woman, I know it's changed, but her domain still exists.
Yeah. But also, Owen, I think another factor is that for economic reasons allied to all of that Ireland became, in that period, in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th and the early 20th century, became essentially a gerontocracy, because you had old couples in family homes, and they might have several children, quite a few children maybe, but they remained in control, and one of their children would be destined to inherit the farm, but would have to wait until they died. And if in the occasional event where, say, a man would bring in a new woman, a wife in, she was subject to the rule of the old pair, and in particular to the grandmother, So there was all these strange kind of undertows in the culture that really nobody's gone into. There's a fantastic book, The Vanishing Irish, which was a book of essays, came out in 1954 in the United States. Had several writers. Sean O'Phelan had an essay in it, and John D. Sheridan, but mainly they were Irish-American academics. And they went into this issue in really, not this aspect of it, but the general demographic crisis that was there, not just in Ireland itself, but actually within the Irish-American community in America, for that very same reason. The same patterns were found there. They weren't so much in Britain for some reason that I haven't really, or at least I haven't seen anything that goes into them in that way. But, really what you understand then when you look at that stuff, Owen, is that Ireland was in crisis forever. From that, the crisis never really abated and hasn't. No. It's still there, because now we are sending our children out to Australia while we're importing half the world. We're giving our country to the world, and we're saying, well, we're out of here now. It's not so much that we sold our country, it's been sold from under us. And we're basically arranging to provide vacant possession of the island for the new owners.
John, we could go on and on, because this is my hobby horse. I love anthropology, history, all of this. But listen, we might bore people, but I doubt it. But let's bring that up into the present. Let's think about, so we have this clear image of Ireland and maybe some of the creeping issues that were slowly maybe unraveling. But then over the course of this pandemic, it's just boom, lightning. It's just everything changes at speed. How did this happen in Ireland? I mean, we took great pride in always in, we always thought ourselves as very level-headed, very, we don't fall for this or fall for that. We're an even keel. How come the Irish bought into the pandemic hook, line, and sinker?
It still remains a mystery to some extent, but undoubtedly there were various. In the book, I tried to work through various possibilities and various kind of instruments that were used. I mean, propaganda being a big one.
Yeah, I saw that in chapter 9. That's interesting. Maybe you would like to talk a little bit about that.
But just that the propaganda we see, we don't really understand what propaganda is. At least I didn't, and I don't think most people do either. Propaganda isn't just slightly skewed information. Like it's a constant wash of a pseudo reality, of a false reality. And that creates this. I mean, in the pandemic, so called, it was the idea that there was a pandemic and that we were all in mortal danger of death at any moment, and that we were a risk to each other, and that each other person was a risk to me and to you, and that this was a complete fabrication. And no basis in reality whatsoever. And 10 years earlier, that had been rumbled at source. When they tried it with the swine flu business, and it was completely collapsed within days. And so, but now this time it took. And
yeah.
I mean, of course, one of the things was, you see, really, the timing of this at least was to do, as I say, not with health, but with wealth. It was to do with money. And on the 15th of August in 2019, the world's biggest asset management company, BlackRock, issued a directive to the Federal Exchange in America and to the G20 and various interested parties, saying that the world economy was in serious crisis and needed to be taken down. And that's essentially, that was the trigger that set off the process for the timing of the pandemic, which was in train for years, of course. They were just looking for a suitable moment. But it was the ubiquitous nature of the thing that I think was the most effective, because they constructed reality. You just think about it we grew up in Ireland, and we know that one of the most redeeming factors of Irish politics is incompetence, right? So.
Right.
So like when you walked around your streets, like within a day or two of the announcement of this so-called World Health, by the World Health Organization, this pandemic, and so little white men on the ground and arrows and 6 meters and telling you what 6 meters and yellow everywhere, COVID yellow, and all the, you kind of, there's something fishy about this, isn't there?
Yeah.
Because it would have taken about 9 months for the Irish government on previous form to get that sort of stuff organised. But it was delivered to them on day 2, and they had it up on day 3. And then they were working on the cycle lanes, and they were working on everything. So that's another aspect of it. But one of the most chilling aspects of the whole thing was, and I go into this in the book as well, was the whole idea that the weaponization of groupthink, that they created a massive groupthink in the population through television. And the television was almost like sacramental in that time. I never watched it, don't have TV, but I used to go for a walk in the evenings, and I walk around the area where I live, and I'd see the screen in every window, like you'd see into huddled, watching it, staring at this, and it was like that people were being indoctrinated with this idea, and there was a kind of a score chart, again going back to the idea of play, of a game, that the scoreboard was up there, the number of deaths, the number of tests, the number of positives, the number of negatives, etc.
Right. Literally, yeah. I remember they had these ticking clocks. One of the biggest YouTube channels at the time, hundreds of thousands of views every day, was a live clock of COVID deaths. I mean, it was bizarre, really, when you think back.
Yeah. But the groupthink thing is deeply sinister, because one of the things, the most important thing for groupthink is not just the in-group in the sense that to convince everybody of the same narrative. It's to create an out-group.
Right.
Outside.
That you can project anger and hate onto.
peering in the window, you know, planning your downfall, planning the destruction of the people of the in-group, you know. And once you convince the in-group of that, they will just go along with anything. And that's where we got the far right and the anti-vaxxers,
Absolute.
all these groups, you know. So we became the scapegoats of that because we had raised a question or two.
Right.
And that was how that was done. And so we helped them in a certain sense, perversely, you know, but
Right. You're of course right. I covered that here in Germany quite extensively. I walked with the marchers every Monday at various points in South Baden-Württemberg, and it was the most bizarre thing to see people shouting out windows. Deppen is like, it's a kind of idiot, and you know, it was almost like the medieval throwing dirt at the condemned as they marched. But we were marching along, and the police with the riot gear, heavy duty stuff, and but what was most hilarious to me in that moment and ever since was getting to, I remember in Ulm where there was a big demonstration every Monday, you would get to the end point and there they would have cordoned off a counter demo, and it was Antifa, politicians from every party, churches, NGOs, and it really struck me at that point, what a strange new coalition.
Well, you see, this is now we're really there now, you see. Because this is the strange thing about this thing. You know, how will I start this? You know, we grew up with thinking about politics. We grew up thinking about work. You know, you go out into the workplace, you work for your living. You know, you do useful things. Politics, the purpose of government is to see that everything works efficiently, that the people's affairs are looked after efficiently. It's all for the good. It's all for the good, right? But here you had this bizarre pretense that there was a problem when there wasn't one. And it was the sheer scale of the reaction to it, the response, the measures, the policing, the enforcement, that convinced people more than anything that this must be real, because surely to God they wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't.
Shock and awe.
Yeah. So that, you know, that the measure was the scale of the response to nothing created the impression that there was something really significant. And people kept looking at the response. They did, because if you actually said to people, well, how many people have died in your street? How many ambulances did you see in your street today? And so they'd look at you blankly. Of course, there were none. There was no visible evidence of actually a pandemic where it should have been, but only on TV and in the streets where there were demonstrations against it and cameras to record what happened. So this is one of the greatest confidence tricks in history, probably the greatest confidence trick actually, to create this impression. And so many people bought into it because they just couldn't believe that this could be happening if it wasn't true, if there wasn't a danger. Because, you know, politicians used to be such sober. I mean, this would mean, it's the kind of like the appalling Vista thing of Lord Denny, you know, that, well, if to paraphrase, you know, if there was no pandemic, well, this would mean that these politicians were fooling the people up to their eyeballs. It would mean
doctors,
that the police
all kinds of trusted pillars of society.
Yeah, and that's such an appalling vista that all right-thinking people must agree that we shouldn't even consider it.
Right.
That was basically how it was done. And it was done for a long time. I mean, the bizarre thing was, like, you know, I said in the court, when we were in court, you know...
John, explain to people who might be listening and unfamiliar with the court case. Just explain the basis of it.
Yeah, well, myself and Jim O'Doherty, who was also, you know, a former mainstream journalist, decided we kind of assumed that we would be trampled to death in the rush to do the same thing, but nobody else thought of it or wanted to do it. So we decided to challenge the constitutionality of what was happening, because, you know, the articles 40 to 44 of the Irish Constitution basically would give you the right to, you know, to walk the streets by definition, and to protest, and to free speech, and to, you know, religious observance, and, you know, go to mass and go to your service, whatever you want. That there can be no There's nothing. These are unqualified right. The language of it is extreme. And it's very interesting that the Supreme Court, 6 months later, found that the language is extreme. But funnily enough, they were dealing with a case taken by Africans. However, another story. You see, like this is what
Another story, same story.
this is what goes on in our country now, But when we went to the court like there were all the seats. Every second seat had tape on it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a poster, a COVID poster.
That's right.
All over the walls. And I said to the judge, when we finally got to the Supreme Court, and it was still happening, 2.5 years later, they were still there. And I said to them, there were 7 judges, like, of the most eminent judges in the land. And I said, are you guys serious? I said, look at these posters. We come in here seeking to make an argument on neutral ground. Basically, to begin, we were hoping to get fair hearing for the idea that this is all nonsense. And you're here in your courtroom and you have everywhere supposed evidence that it's real. Now, it's a bit like if I was here on a charge of murder and I walked into the courtroom and the first thing I saw was posters, wanted, John Waters, murder. Everywhere.
Right.
How much faith would I have in the court?
Absolutely. Yeah, good point.
But that's what was happening. That was the absurdity of everything that was happening. So, but the most shocking thing really was the silence of liberals, the silence of left-wingers who had spoken about democracy and freedom and all these things so eloquently for years. They were nowhere to be seen. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties, silence. And the media, as I say, attacking anybody who questioned it. It was unbelievable. Now, it's very interesting. You see, now, bearing in mind what I was saying about the family courts as kind of a pilot scheme or a rehearsal for something of invasion. I mean, when you think about it, when it finally got to the stage where the guards were allowed to come into your house and count the number of people sitting on your sofa, in theory anyway.
Right.
If depending on what level you were at of the game, you were allowed certain numbers of people and then no more.
Yeah.
And so on. I kind of when you look at all that stuff, like you think, like how is it that nobody. Like that was really from the family law kind of rehearsal, like that they were finally saying, almost like in a Kafkaesque way, that opening scene of the trial where the 2 guys come to arrest Joseph K. And the most appalling thing about it is that they sit down at the table and they eat his breakfast. Mm. And that to me was that's the most resonant thing in that opening. The opening, one of the greatest opening sentences of any book ever in history. Somebody must have been telling lies about Joseph K. because without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. And then it goes on. But that was the thing, that they had the right to eat his breakfast. Right. And they had the right to count the people on your sofa.
Yeah,
and they had
the right you have zero personal rights in your most intimate space, yeah.
And so I one of the chapters in the book that I think is most interesting is an account of the work of a German philosopher called Michel Esfeld, who has written this series of essays propounding the thesis that what has happened now, this whole episode, and where we are and where we're going, was inevitable from the moment that the Berlin Wall came down. And the theory is that the whole idea of Western democracy and freedom was really only a kind of a conceit that was intended to last only for as long as the Soviet Union lasted, as a kind of a way of making a contradistinction with Soviet communism and tyranny and so on. So we were the free West.
A good guy to their bad guy, right?
Modern. But once the Berlin Wall came down, there was no further need for it. So it began to erode, and that this was a deliberate erosion. It was calculated. That basically they had been seeking to bring us to totalitarianism. I mean, indeed, again, when you go back to BlackRock, the chief executive of BlackRock, Larry Fink, has famously said that democracy is a very poor fit for the modern forms of capitalism. He says totalitarianism is better.
At least he's honest. At least
Yeah,
he's straight up.
give it up to him. You got to give it up because he's straight.
He's straight, exactly. At least he's telling you what while he's screwing you.
So this is really the scale of. I mean, this is not about our health. COVID was not about COVID.
No.
That's what I say. The book. I don't want people to misleadingly think this is a book about COVID. It's not a book about COVID. It's a book about what COVID means, and that's a different thing altogether.
Well, John, I look at the immediate line from what you're talking about, the direct and obvious, to me, the most obvious line from that time, that moment of when the police could come and into your house and tell you who you can and can't have there, to the forced iPass centres around Ireland. That, to me, it's mind-blowing that the government can say no. What's it? No consultation, no veto. Every one of the big three said no consultation, no veto. That, as bad as Ireland was, that would have been impossible 20 years ago.
Completely impossible. I mean, culturally, it would be laughed at.
Yeah.
Just as the COVID thing would have been. I mean, I often used to say, that. I remember that idea. What was it they called cocooning? You know what I mean? Remember that period where we were cocooning, and I can imagine the old fellas that I knew growing up, in the pub, so, well, you're cocooning for the weekend, yeah. And this will be the greatest joke of all time, there was something in the spirit of the people that resisted tyranny.
There was, John. That's something that I was proud of as an Irishman, and it was a prime motivator for leaving because we lost that during the Celtic Tiger. I noticed a change in the Irish mindset in the Celtic Tiger that frightened me. I'm not at all surprised by what's come. Yeah, by how intense and the speed of change in Ireland, but I wasn't surprised. I saw a mind shift at that time that frightened me, and
yes.
I just. As you said, we prided ourselves on our resistance to tyranny. We prided ourselves on being able to smell bullshit 10 kilometers away. We really did, and that's what kept us balanced. We used to look at England and say they're lunatics over there, okay, let them burn their society to the ground. But then somehow from 2010 on, they decided, oh no, we're going to be like them at record speed.
Well, you see, here we are. I remember the real 1984, the actual year. I mean, and I was in hot press at that time. And at the beginning of the year, I suggested that the hot press had a column, a little box called the Mad Hatter's Box on page 3. It was basically some singer, guitarist, celebrity, whatever, would be asked kind of about 20 daft questions. There was a printout that was sent out, and they would fill it out, and all kinds of, what's your favorite color, and do you have your shower in the morning or in the evening, whatever, that kind of stuff. I'm not sure if that was in there, but that's a bit loaded nowadays. But I suggested to the editor that we do Winston Smith. And he thought it was a great idea. And so I became Winston Smith. Now I don't have it. I wish I had. I will find it one day. But my point is that there was an acute awareness of that year in Ireland then and the meaning of all of that, right? That had completely drained away by 2020. The awareness, the kind of wariness,
yes,
the attention that was necessary to maintain that vigilance against
self-preservation.
Yes, that had gone. And you were to the point where you got hot press joining in with the tyranny.
Hot presses, oh man. When I think of yourself, Graham Lenihan, Doherty, who all came through it, and then you look at it now, oh.
Yeah, it's a shocking thing. And that's everything. Like, it's musicians, it's actors, it's writers, it's poets, it's novelists.
Education, culture, in every way. It's the
Yes,
newspapers.
yes.
John, but how did it happen so quickly is the question. I know there was drip, 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 as you explained very well there with the example of the children's courts, that there was, the roots were there long. But it just seems to me that from 2010 to today, there has been such a radical shift in how gullible, not gullible, but susceptible Irish people have become to
Well,
all of this propaganda.
I think that a critical event was the LGBT assault, which started in 2014. I mean, that was what it resulted in me leaving journalism. I was driven out by a mob of LGBTers, homosexualists.
That was
And
the Irish Times, right?
yeah,
You
well,
were
the Irish Times basically threw me to the wolves. I mean, the Irish Times, the editor wouldn't even take my calls. He wouldn't answer my emails,
really.
Left me hanging out to dry. Kevin O'Sullivan, an appalling creature. But you see, yeah, that was. But what that created in my
What
view,
was your line of criticism on that, John?
I didn't really have any. I didn't have time, actually, to adopt one. They just assumed I was going to.
Okay. So you didn't come up with some incendiary hot take.
No. They came after me. A drag queen on the TV accused me of being a homophobe. I hadn't said anything about it at that stage. I mean, my underlying issue.
So that was the first. Was that the first mob, John? The culture mob that you spotted in Ireland?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Mob.
I was the first to go. And I kind of, to some extent, self-cancelled. I walked away before they could garrote me. But you see, yeah, but that created what I call mutism, because basically what those guys did was to say, if you have any thoughts that we don't agree with, we're going to destroy you.
Yes.
And not only are we going to destroy you directly, but we'll turn your children against you. We'll make your children hate you. We have that power. So, think it over. If you want to continue doing what you're doing and saying what you're saying, that's all very well up to you. But, we kind of seriously suggest to you that you might think it true. And that was kind of their tone, my position would have been, insofar if I had time to put it out there, I mean, I would certainly have serious questions about what happened, which was the placing of gay marriage in as an equal phenomenon with man and woman, childbearing couples, intrinsically capable of procreation. I mean, that's an absurdity beyond belief, because it's an assault on nature. You're basically saying that a couple that cannot, remotely procreate.
Yours wasn't even, say, a religious, moral, purely argument. Yours was just strictly rational, scientific.
That's right. Well, that only was later. I mean, I that would be my position. But allied to that was this, going back to what I said earlier, the sense of absolute incomprehension and disbelief that the politicians who had ignored me for 20 years, talking about fathers and the way they were being treated and trampled on by savage judges, were basically now going off on one for a tiny minority, extending them rights, not just to marriage, but to parenting rights and family rights, and placing them in the Constitution as equals of a man and a woman. So in other words, that, for example, one of the things I was pointing out, like that, if a normal marriage had broken up, and a father and mother had broken up, and the mother then subsequently became involved in a lesbian relationship, well, her new partner would have superior rights to the father of the children under this new dispensation, in de facto terms, because the courts were not giving rights to fathers other than...
You were just simply arguing based on your expertise over years of family law.
Yes, and just that shock, and I still feel that sense of shock. When I think of the politicians that wasted my time, Liz O'Donnell and Enda Kenny and these people talking to me, pretending that they cared about this issue. Jim McDade was another one.
But it's an awful betrayal that the Irish Times didn't stand behind you.
Utterly, yeah. But you see, this is the thing. When Hardy came to Hardy, you see, the Irish Times had changed. I mean, journalists, the old the old kind of stalwarts had gone. Like Douglas Gately was the great editor of the Irish Times, and he was a very solid piece of work,
Okay.
I knew him personally, and he was great. He got me in a bit, to the Irish Times. He wanted me to join when I was editor in Dublin, and eventually I did. But he was a very solid person, and he insisted on things. I mean, that was what I said earlier. When you work, it was drummed into you that when I started like that, when you were out there in public, say making a speech or whatever, you were there represent. If you were a columnist, you were representing the Irish Times. So you had to behave in a certain way, deferentially towards people and be polite and not into rows and all that. That all went with the Twitter phase, you see. And the Twitter thing created these kind of flash mobs, which the LGBT crews use. And the journalists were
They mastered Twitter. I mean, let's be honest, it was all of these social justice groups, they mastered early Twitter.
Well, it's very interesting too, when you think about it in this context, that in those years when the Irish government was trying to use these mobs to impose its will on the Irish people in terms of constitutional issues and referendums and so on, and the gay marriage thing, the abortion thing and so on, there was no talk about hate speech then. They weren't interested in anybody being hateful about John Waters, for example.
No.
And there was no shortage of stuff. I mean, I remember one time coming across this series of tweets, and it was a thing, I don't know what you call it, a meme that was going around. It was like, if you see John Waters, give him a punch from me.
Yeah, but this is beyond unacceptable. And you're right, anyone who stepped out, well, there you go. This is an important piece of the puzzle then, because looking at the COVID years, that they had normalized this. They had normalized putting the target on the outside, and already it was proto-labeling you far right, say, by like punch a Nazi, hit these, that already. So that's a crucial point then. The first LGBTQ activist clique, social media influenced. So there we have an important node on the map, I would say, right? The decline of the power of the traditional media and good editors who should have stood behind you. The rise of this social media, which was brilliantly, if not deviously, harnessed by the social justice activist mobs.
That's right.
Into the COVID.
And you see, this then expanded as the years went on, so that by the time, say, of the 2020 election, in which I kind of foolishly ran as a candidate under persuasion from certain people.
Why would you say foolishly, John? Do you regret it?
Well, I wasn't well at the time. I had been very ill for the previous year, and I couldn't really fight so I got about 1,000.
Okay, it's just you couldn't do the campaign as you would have liked to.
My poor wife was out in the mornings, like out at the DART stations getting abused because she had my poster with her or whatever, like that's what you're dealing with. But the other thing I noticed in the course of that campaign was that that insurgency spirit had by some process of contagion had spread from the LGBT goons to the Antifa goons, who were now on the streets putting anybody who tried to have a political meeting that wasn't approved of by the government was basically harassed and tyrannized and terrorized. And the Antifa would be on the streets, and I saw this with my own two eyes, masked with scarves, etc., and hand in glove with An Garda Síochána.
That's right. That's right.
The meeting that the government had ordered should not take place. Now, this is hard for people to believe. People are very naive about this country still, because there is a normalization process that goes on through RTE and the Irish Times and all this, that everything is as it always was. No, it isn't. Like, for example, this is my second book now, in the last, say, 10 years, that I've run into problems. I'm running into problems with trying to promote, because my book in 2018, Give Us Back the Bad Roads, none of the distributors wouldn't distribute it. They would claim they would suppress it. They suppressed it. They basically shadow banned it. I've obviously
But
got.
they wouldn't put them in the physical bookstores in Eason's or wherever.
They did. They might put in one or two in an obscure category over in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
and then of course the woke floor staff wouldn't do the rest,
of
and
course.
people were actually abused for even looking for it in various shops. It was unbelievable. One shopowner down in Cork told me that he had ordered a quantity of books and they never arrived. You know, all of these things were coming. I was getting feedback all the time about it. The same thing is beginning to happen now. Well, I mean, my book. I'm not trying at the moment to put my book into bookshops because I don't think it's a worthwhile exercise. So I'm it's on Amazon. It was at #1 as Amazon
I
last
saw
week.
that. Terrific. Well done. Congratulations.
So, but it's going to be a long slog. I'm going to do a few. I'm trying to have launches, but I'm already finding that launches are being cancelled. You
How
know,
bad did it get, John, with you? I didn't realize now that you were attracting so much trouble, say, out in the streets, out in real
yeah.
life.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the streets, like during the 20 years of the
I mean, you're not an extreme guy in any way. You're a mainstream, journalist your whole life. You know, you were,
I
and
would say,
and you were one of a
but the thing,
handful of dissenting voices. Why aren't we allowed even have one dissenting voice? You know,
because the truth is now illegal, essentially. The truth is the thing they're most scared of. They can't have you tell the truth because that will destroy their pseudo reality. And therefore anybody who continues to all I'm saying is basically common sense on
yeah.
any issue. I mean, people may disagree with me around the edges of things, but fundamentally most people out there in Ireland, in the mainstream of Ireland, would say, yeah, that's what I think too. You know, like like mass migration, for
I
example.
think so.
My position on mass migration is exactly that of Thomas Aquinas, who is the guy who is supposed to have provided the teaching of the Catholic Church on that issue. So the clergy are miles away. They're completely ignoring the official teaching of the Church and their own catechism by saying what they're saying. But, you know, there we are. And so this is the shocking thing. Like, under all kinds of headings now, Ireland has ceased to be a democracy. And I have written a lot about this. I have traced this and I've constructed a model, hypothesis, which I think is now pretty much proven, which is that Ireland was subjected to a form of coup in 2011. And that coup has maintained ever since. If you think of the governments we've had in between, the elections we've had, essentially we've had the same government back each time in one form or another. Certainly ideologically,
Yeah.
no difference. I mean,
There's nothing between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, or Sinn Féin for that matter.
when you just think about it, like Fine Gael, Enda Kenny and Labour in the first place. Okay, in 2011. Then 2016, we got Enda Kenny with Fianna Fáil, Micheál Martin, confidence and supply system.
Mm-hmm.
Same government, essentially.
Yeah.
Then we got Varadkar taking over from Kenny, same government. Then in 2020, they were booted out. I mean, in 2016 and 2020, they were effectively booted out, but there was nobody to replace them other than themselves. So they replaced themselves. And in 2020, you know, we had this appalling situation where for 5 months there was this caretaker government, or whatever they would call themselves, and they brought in the most draconian legislation in history, having been booted out in February. And then at the end of June, Fianna Fáil, Martin took over as Taoiseach from Varadkar. So you have all of this. So now we have the same government again. I mean, imagine this, like that 5 years of the cruelest, most inhuman government we've ever had in independence. They get back in again. There's no change. It's like nothing.
There's no possibility of change. I say always that Ireland's a crippled democracy.
Yeah.
And Sinn Féin I have a lot of anger towards, because they were meant to be in opposition, and they weren't, and they aren't. They've gone along with the big two on everything. All the big decisions over the past decade, they were there, and the only difference was they wanted more.
There's a Spanish word, autogolpe, for it means self-coup. And I say that Ireland had an auto golpe assistido, an assisted self-coup in 2011, when essentially after the arrival of the Troika and the seizing of Ireland's economic sovereignty, Ireland was made an offer it couldn't refuse by higher powers. And they said, we'll run your country, we'll tell you how to do it, we'll do it, you'll be okay, but you'll just do what we say. Yeah. And we need a constant government, we need a sane government, we need none of this nonsense about opposition, democracy, that's gone, over. And that's essentially what's happened. And if you look at the events of 2011, I won't go into it now, but it's too detailed, but there's various things that happened that year that really are red flags to me. Like the emergence of Democracy Now!, for example, in late 2010, if you remember that, David McWilliams and Fenton O'Toole and others proposed that they were going to basically basically a kind of revolution.
That's right.
Which would have overturned the existing Big Beast party, the Civil War parties. That was the plan. Many people in Ireland at that time were thinking along similar lines.
They wanted it, I remember.
Yes, but Fenton O'Toole said, no, we're doing it. And everybody said, well, okay, I mightn't agree with Fenton about everything, but he's a solid guy. He's he got a lot of integrity. Yeah, I'd vote for him. Yeah, let's do it. And then what happened? At the very last minute, they pulled plant. And said, no, sorry, we haven't got enough time. As I wrote at the time, the revolution has been cancelled because we couldn't find a babysitter.
And by what a crucial moment that was.
Yes.
Because instead, people before profit, all of these leftist parties profited. And that then has been the story of Ireland ever since. That if there was a collapse, a revolution tomorrow, if the scales fell from the ice, the problem is the people could only go left.
That's the problem. There's nobody there now at all. There's nobody. And then if you remember as well, there's two other things I'll draw people's attention to. I've done this before, but in May of that year, in the same week, there were 2 state visits to Ireland, to Dublin. One by the Queen of England, Elizabeth, and the second, just a day or two later, by Obama, the President of the United States. And it seemed to me that they were kind of almost occult rituals of handover of the keys and the deeds of Ireland to foreign powers again. And I think I'm pretty solid in that belief. And then, of course, the big thing that happened then later that year was the presidential election, when we had our Trump before Trump, Sean Gallagher, who was running away with it a week before the poll. And he was taken out in an ambush on RTE by Martin McGuinness and Pat Kenny. I mean, I believe, I knew Sean Gallagher. I spent some time with him on that campaign trail. He was a very decent guy. He was very liked. He took people by surprise. I mean, people didn't, because he was only known as the Dragon's Den guy, but he made a real connection with the electorate, and he had 42%, as I recall, a week before the election. That was enough. That would be enough for an overall majority for a party. So he was going to walk it, and they attacked him on a Monday night on RTE, and by Thursday he was gone.
That was then the last chance for any kind of.
And if you think about it, Owen, like, where would that matter? Well, the president doesn't have a huge power, but he has power. He would have had power in, say, July of 2021 to refuse to sign Irish apartheid into Irish law, health apartheid into Irish law, which Michael D. Higgins did. A man who was a friend of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So, riddle me that.
But also culturally, the president can have an influence, and culture is going to be the seed of anything new in Ireland. It has to. The only change that can come from Ireland right now, looking at the way things are going, is economic matters from outside imposed. A financial crash of one way or another, or well, actually, that's about it. That's all I can see right now, because after the last general election, I think the last general election was the end of new nationalism 1.0. I think, you know, the parties didn't get the breakthroughs they wanted on the new right here in Ireland, and they've been fighting with each other ever since. So I don't know what's going to come next. I'm worried about what's going to come next.
So am I. So am I. I think they've shot their bolt. You know, there's no way this crew can go back to basics and start again. I don't think.
No,
So
no.
something new will have to happen.
Is that what you reckon too, John? That's what my feeling is. My feeling is that it needs to be a fresh start.
I mean, that's why I was somewhat buoyed up by the McGregor episode, even though it has its, you know, downsides and dark sides. I thought that the disruptive aspect of that was positive in the sense that it was going to draw attention to Ireland and its plight and in America, and that maybe something would come out of that. But it seems to me that, you know, the nationalist movement in Ireland is very, I mean, it's very shallow, I think, in terms of ideas and vision anyway. And there's a lot of infighting. I mean, very much the tenor of it is to my mind, what's emerging is, you know, kind of quasi-leftist tenor, you know, old-fashioned kind of leftism, and that's the
interesting. What are you seeing, John, that makes you say that?
Well, just I suppose,
generally speaking, I know now I don't want to get you in anyone's crosshairs here, so just general.
I think one of the things I have a theory that that the government deliberately targeted Dublin working class areas with migrants for a particular reason, which was that that it would have that, you know, tenor, that it would seem to be a Dublin, that the resistance would seem to be a Dublin-based thing. And you see, in Dublin, in Ireland, rightly or wrongly, there is that always culture jacking kind of divide.
Yeah. There always will be. Yeah.
You know, Middle Ireland, like, you know, in the sense of the people of Tipperary or Roscommon or whatever, they've always been kind of a little bit kind of, I don't know what the word is, suspicious maybe of Dublin in that sense, because they feel that they're being condescended to by Dubliners, and so they don't respond particularly well to clarion calls emanating from Dublin. That's the problem. Dublin is a very strange city because, in a strange way, it's not Dublin anymore. It's kind of vacated. Dublin, the people have mainly left Dublin, you know, and it's to a high degree it's run by cultures, you know, and that's been a big problem. That struck me, and Dublin, you see, is really a series of villages. That's the way it's built. This struck me very forcibly about 10 years ago when I was coming to the end of my life in the Irish Times, when I did a series of articles about the canals, and I walked the canals, you know, in Dublin, and the Grand Canal and the Royal Canal, and I was really struck by this, that you could see in the canal, in the way it was kept and the way it was looked after and so on, the way it was cleaned, the different villages as you went through them. And it's very marked. And you see, so Dublin is a kind of a village. That's still there, you know, to a high degree. Although a lot of the communities in the inner city have been gentrified, as they say. But there's a little bit of that left. But at the same time, you know, the people of Dublin don't really have much of a say in their city. The indigenous people, and just as the indigenous people of Ireland are now, it seems, doomed to the same fate in their country. But there's that kind of strange kind of situation whereby the cultures kind of moved into the city and took the power, the levers of power in the city, but they never really were part of it. And so what people are, you know, there's no real connection between, Dublin is not a real capital city. That's my view. I've always felt that. It's not the capital city of Ireland. London has as much claim to being the capital city of Ireland in a certain cultural sense as Dublin has. There may be more, you know.
I know what you mean, yeah.
You
that
know?
goes back again to our history of centralized, the empire city of Dublin imposing on the rest, kind of.
That's right.
Do you know where that really came home to me? It was, do you know, in Kilkee, there was, it's Kilkee, is it? No, it's not. Where is it? Up near Ennistimon, anyway, where they the White family owned all these hotels and sold them out to the government in the very early iPass craze boom, out West Clare. And what struck me was that, you see, in a proper democracy, in a proper country where people have where a government where the government works for the people and where there's a proper connection between. The government can't just come in and throw millions way over the price at a hotel owner who can then take a unilateral decision to force in people from all over the world, unvetted males from Africa and Middle East, and completely change the demographics and the future of that town. You see, in an actual democracy, the people, there was a vote, and it was high. It was 90-something% of the town came together. It's where the Willie Clancy Festival, not the Willie Clancy Festival, the matchmaking festival is. Thank you. Embarrassing. I'm a bloody Clare man. Listen, Barna. So they had a vote, and they voted overwhelmingly no. But you see, that would be the end of it, right? If this was a proper grassroots up democracy, that we would say, look, we said no, so therefore I don't care that you have a hotel or how rich you are, that contract between us as a community supersedes anything. But the problem is that Dublin then said, nope, here's €1 million or whatever, and we're going to ram these people in there. That is the old colonial model of Dublin imposing on the rest of the country. And that's part of the rage and anger of the iPass rollout around the country. And of course, the people of Dublin, the people are just as subject to it and are just as angry. But there is a difference, like you say, in that we've always had this tension between down the country and and Dublin. And the country people always had this, you leave us alone, we leave you alone. We know that you're up there, you've got the big city, and sure, you might be earning more for whatever, but we're happy with our lot as long as you stay there and we stay here. But they broke that contract, and when they started ramming these people in everywhere, and it was, see, when I was younger, it was always a sense that Charlie Haughey was corrupt as anything. All of them were. Everyone. We knew they were skimming off the top. We knew about, the Galway races and the brown envelopes. Everyone knew this. Everyone knew that Irish politics is unbelievably corrupt. But we left you alone with that as long as you left us alone.
Yeah.
And they broke that golden rule of Irish politics when they started ramming these in. No veto, no consultation.
You see,
this is dangerous.
This is the thing, like that. It's hard. This is a hard point to make because people get their feathers ruffled. But it's that it's a little bit like what happened in the north with the IRA. That after a while it became to be that the same accents were held all over and over again, and they were the Falls Road and so on, and it was like that. It was a kind of a turf war that had nothing to do with the Irish nation. That it lost the plausibility of being a national struggle pretty early on, and particularly when the bombing campaign started. And you see, this is the problem, that when all I'm saying is, and I'm not saying this from any kind of a self-interested position. I only ran for elections to kind of show people that you can do it, and just to see how to test the water and say, well, but I have no ambitions whatsoever to be in politics. I'm a Sigma. I don't want to be I don't want to be an alpha or a beta. I have no time for any of that. I do my own thing.
Yeah.
And but what I do say is this, that the feel I have got from the movement in the last 5 years has not given me that sense that it will resonate with Middle Ireland. And I can feel that it won't. I can feel that it's not doing it, and I can feel that it's not possible the way it's going on. That there are lots and lots of great people out there who wouldn't get into this because they don't like the look of it. Now it's not, and it's in part, of course, because of the propaganda and the far right smear and all that kind of stuff. Sure. But there's deeper elements of it, and there's a few people anyway who seem to be going out of their way to discredit the movement from within by taking up daft kind of issues and promoting them like flat earth or whatever it is. That's not going to turn people on either. You know what I mean? It's not. This is not, like, I keep telling people, like, let's focus on getting our country back. and then we'll work out about the Earth, what shape the Earth is afterwards.
Right. Right.
You know, so like, and you see all this kind of stuff, and every week now there's a new episode, like, and it's like, oh no, like that, you know, there's, you know, Bridie and Paddy, you know, they're watching, they're worried, they're concerned, they know there's something seriously wrong. They wish there was some place they could go to join something that would fight this in a really coherent way. They're not seeing it. And I mean, we only need, what is it, 80 or so good men and true, good women and true, to go into Dáil Éireann and turn all this round.
No, yeah, sure.
And they're out there in far greater numbers. But they're not going to join a movement such as the present one.
No, that's my feeling too, John. I think that the last election proved it. You know, let's talk in hard facts that was the end of this cycle, and okay, there wasn't the appetite there. And since then, I feel like the people in the movement have retreated into bickering and becoming purity spiraling, and they're becoming an online movement even more disconnected from the general voter, and that's not good. I think, and again, now some people don't like me saying it, but the removal of Herman Kelly from the Irish Freedom Party this week is very significant, because the Irish Freedom Party, at least under his vision of it, was the populist option on the Irish right. This new movement. You have A&2 Independent Ireland, who are very much centre leftish, even in some areas, but centre. Then you had the National Party, who are identitarian right, in line with, say, the Martin Sellners and the identitarian movement on the continent. But then you needed, like, say, the Trump, the AFD style populist option, and that got removed this week, which means that I'm seeing a polarization now into centrist, and I don't believe this identitarianism is mass appeal. I don't think that your average Joe has any interest in that, and I don't think that they have interest in appealing. They're waiting for this cataclysmic event where they're going to seize power, kind of, or they're going to, the great moment of. It's not going to happen that way. It never happens that way.
They want to hear practical, commonsensical descriptions of what's happening, what the problems are, and how they might be faced. And there are huge problems. I mean, we're in serious trouble. We're terminal. It's terminal. Like, there's no.
It is. Yeah, it is.
And that needs to be addressed. But I mean, this talk about ethno-nationalism and stuff is not helping. Nobody's interested in that. I'm sorry, but that's it.
And it's the easiest. It's the easiest thing in the world for an ambitious journalist who's eyeing up his future advisory position in the government to come out and slime it, to come out and just tear it apart. You're just making it too easy for him. You're just, as well as just being unattractive, like, to the natural. And also, you see, the solution to Ireland's problem will come from within Ireland too. That's. There again, an imposition of this this continental European vision. Like I say, under Martin Sellner, he's taken the National Party under his wing. I saw him tweet out to him this week as well, including him in his kind of circle of movements that he's kind of. He's claiming influence over. But the point being that what's happening there is that we've two generations working against each other on the right. That, we have this first generation, the AFD, the populist generation, which is coming to fruition now in many ways, or it's on that borderline. So, but now you have this younger generation who are tired of waiting for that to come to fruition, who are coming up outside of that, and they're saying we're just going to ram through, and they're not. It's not going to happen. And they're going to and what happened there was they cut out Ireland's reform, Ireland's AFD, Ireland's, MAGA.
They did.
And they're not providing an electable alternative. And so to me, that has been a hugely destructive event this week. Long time in the making. Yeah,
because you see, even in Germany, you can see now what's happening. I mean, you can see the fangs are now bare, with regard to so-called democracy in Europe, because they're not democratic and they're almost not any longer pretending that they are, because they're basically saying they're going to make the AFD illegal. And that's what they will do in the final analysis. In Ireland, they nipped it in the bud, really. They don't care how they do it. They just want to make sure that they maintain their coup in each country, and that the government that they have that's in there is in control of the superpowers who are deciding the overarching powers, the predators who are running all this. And and I don't feel that there's much consciousness of this aspect of it within the Irish movement.
And I think in the Irish movement there's too much emotion too, not enough rational. So I see a lot of people, they're purity spiraling. They're going into harder and harder into their own corner, but they have no sense of strategy. They have no sense of it's us or nothing. And
that's the thing I found when in the election, in the European election, being attacked from within the movement for being, over people's heads, when all I'm doing is trying to explain what's going on in its detail and in its complexity. Because
I didn't know that was a criticism. That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I was even accused somebody ambushed me on a Twitter space, and said that by talking about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I was over people's heads. That people weren't interested in hearing this stuff. That's crazy stuff. If that's the level of our discussion, then we're in bigger trouble than I ever dreamt.
That's depressing. But I'm not surprised. I'm not. There's a strange. I keep seeing people shouting about, we need unity, lads. We need it, and first of all, there's a complete unwillingness to acknowledge. So take, for example, AN2. People shouting at AN2 because they won't back the National Party. AN2 can't touch the National Party, and you have to accept that. And if they go and do anything with the National Party, they will be ostracized. They'll never be on RTE again. They'll never be accepted by mainstream voters again, because the National Party, as I say, have made themselves too easy to label. And the thing is, you don't have to agree with everything that AN2 say or do. Let them do some of the work for you by dragging things slowly right, and that opens the door for you. They don't strategize like this. They don't see it's all or nothing.
I completely agree. And in fact, I will have to say to AN2's credit, it didn't really didn't come to anything, but they actually, Pater Tobin was recommending the people transfer his votes. To make his second preference, and that would have been a big thing if I had actually managed to get over that particular portal and into the next phase. That would have been a huge benefit to me. Who knows? But the fact that they were willing to do that tells you that they're much more open than they're accused of being.
Right, and they're smart. They're doing it as a political party needs to do it.
Yeah,
they're not just making big exclamations on social media saying, "Wow." That's stupid. You're going to get cut down.
And I have to say that the National Party, so-called, were not so obliging with regard to transfers in my direction.
No, they're insular. I've noticed that they're very insular. They're doing their own thing. But people need to understand that the right is a broad tapestry and everybody has a role. And if you just don't make enemies you don't need to make. Don't be stupid. Don't be purity spiraling. All I've seen on the right, nationalist party, I will rarely see nationalists. In fact, I've never seen any coordinated now by a group of nationalists, be it a party or individuals looking for a party. I have never in all my time there seen a coordinated attack, an attack on an establishment party. All I see are coordinated attacks on other nationalists. And it's insane. It's just
100%. That's what I keep saying to these people. Why are you attacking me? Why not attack the Taoiseach?
That's it. This is the problem. Like I said, now and this week they've gotten what they've wanted. Now there's the nationalist movement is this hardcore ethno-nationalist identitarian right, which is tiny, and the mainstream won't touch. And you've got A and 2 who have their problems. They're not strong enough on certain elements of legal migration, and they're, for me anyway, economically they're too far left. They're too much about state interventions. But but that's what now all the sniping has done. You see, it has forced people, all the rational people will say, I mightn't agree with Independent Ireland or N2, but I have to go to them because I can't go to these guys. They removed that middle ground, which was Kelly's Irish Freedom Party.
Yes, you see, this is the thing, Owen. Like, when people look at parties and candidates, they're looking at different aspects. And of course, there may be such a thing as a protest vote here and there. But as also a part of all their considerations at all times must be the capacity of the person, the candidate or the party, to eventually, if necessary, rule, to go into government, to be, and unfortunately, I don't see anything in the movement that is in any way even addressing that.
Right.
Never mind showing that they're fit for it. That's ultimately, we have to give a vision of what kind of country we want to create and how we're going to make it different and how we're going to deal with the issues. Like, there are profound issues now I won't go into them because they're very controversial, but the context that the country is now in as a result of the last number of years of corruption and criminality on the part of politicians, that needs to be addressed one way or the other. And I don't have any kind of hard and fast. I have certain ideas. I want a discussion to take part. How are we going to deal with, what we're left with now in Ireland? What should be our approach? Nobody's talking about that. And if you try to talk about it, you get accused of being some kind of compromiser.
Yeah, that's right. You're dividing the movement, people love to say. What you said there is extremely, extremely, extremely important. It's the only time I've heard it. And I tried to make this exact point, and I got really taken, a lot of people had a good go. It was around Christmas where I said that. And again, and look, I'll be very clear, I was having it out with the Nationalist Party because I wanted to see what they stood for and what they actually believed in. And the point was, and you said it, you have to imagine it in power. I'm not sure I want to live in an Ireland where the Nationalist Party ruled, because I'm afraid it would be quite a Philistine country. It would be quite a authoritarian country. I'd be quite a place where there would be a lot of repression of freedoms and whatnot. That's the vibe I've gotten from, because there is no wide policy platform here. There is no wide. We've seen the obvious. So and I think the new National Party is very different from Justin Barrett's National Party. He's now gone overtly into National Socialism, which is, again, that is socialist, and that's my fear, is that the National Party would be actually quite a socialist party in reality, in power. That's why we wanted something more. I want something more libertarian, or something more, which is at its core, which is, leave me the hell alone. Look, when we get this glorious revolution, that means I get to go sit in my garden and the world just leaves me the hell alone.
And something that somehow reflects the spirit of Ireland, that kind of idea of people easygoing about certain things, particular about certain other things, vigorous and vigorous about other things, but that there's a subtlety about it. Yes. And that, that it's culture led, and it's rich in its depth, and it's about conversations. And we need our media restored from the ground up, to do that. I mean, there's all these kind of tectonic plates that are in the wrong place now, and we need to align them in some way, because there's, which problem do you fix first? There's all these moving parts. Well, I would say you need a media before you can do anything, in a certain sense.
Of course.
But you need to prepare the ground politically for that moment, that, so maybe we can work the two things in tandem. But nobody's talking like this.
No.
And what you said.
And we need to reform the universities so that we can produce free thinkers and actual balanced thinkers in every.
This is a massive job, Rowan. I mean, you're talking about
precisely. And so I did a lot of spaces with Herman Kelly. I don't want people now thinking that I'm Herman Kelly's guy. I'm not. I'm just calling what I've seen of my experience within this. I'm not looking for fights with anyone. I'm trying to offer free advice if anyone wants to hear. But he was the only one out there who had an a truly expansive platform. He had an energy platform. He was very open to, renewables where it was smart but not imposed. He had a very strong ideas to protect heritage, and and very open to positively promoting heritage and interactions with our landscapes and protections with our fisheries. Things that conversation isn't happening, you see, and that has to happen.
Well, you see, one of the things you said there, it was very telling for me, because, I remember in that election campaign, and indeed since, I've been attacked not from the government. The government just ignore me.
Yeah, right. But like, from the right, I bet.
So from people that I thought were my allies, people that I helped previously in this whole campaign. Supported when they were, coming along, and
that's sad to hear, John. I think
well, it's kind of Brendan Behan's idea. The first thing on the agenda is the split. But I'm kind of inclined to think, well, if I had a choice between that person and Micheál Martin, who would I choose?
This is the thing.
I would hate to have
that's absent, John. Though so often that's absent.
Yeah. Yeah, because I wouldn't think that person is fit to be in office either.
But like I said, there isn't this. That's something to me that and it's terminal, and it's something I've been trying to raise awareness of. And I get trouble for saying it, but the nationalist movement is too emotional. It's too histrionic. It's too much about beating your chest and who is the big, and they're not strategic at all.
I agree with that. And something, a particular bugbear of mine is the use of the word patriot. I don't know about you, but I kind of regard, obviously there's this concept of patriotism, and we all have it. But I would never describe myself as a patriot.
I see it as an imported concept.
Yeah, I would think that you need to be dead for about 50 years from bullet wounds fought.
Correct. That's right. That would be the only right. That's the only way it would fit in the Irish context.
To qualify as a patriot, to be described as such, really.
Yeah.
Seriously. To be going around waving flags and calling yourself a patriot is a bit rich.
No. But I think that we need to, I would like to see, and I had a good interaction with somebody there this week. They were saying to me how Sinn Féin, they're always a united front. You never see them fighting. That's what nationalists need to be. And, I had to spell out that Sinn Féin is a single party. Nationalism is a concept. And there's arguments because there is no defined, in the Irish context, there is no definition for what nationalist is. And that's what's taking place now. But people don't see that right now. There is a turf war between the identitarian, the IFP just fell. So the populists are out. The populist horse fell and the centrists are there. So there's two options still. But people don't want to acknowledge that this exists. It's an amazing blind spot in the nationalist movement. They all think we can all just come together. I'm sorry, but you can't, because there are some people who go around in a Hitler jacket calling people Jew. You're dead. You are dead if you're seen with that. You are dead if you associate with that, and you have to understand that. And if you can't understand that, I don't know how to help you.
Yeah. Well, this is and that problem is there are multiple versions of that.
And exactly, that's just the most extreme version. Exactly right, John.
Yeah. So no, I think it's but maybe we're moving towards some kind of correction.
And that's just one other thing. That's somewhere I would give the electorate credit for. Now, I do have big problems, and it's easy to get down about it, but I do think the electorate is smart in sniffing out that kind of stuff, and I do think the general public absolutely. Now, while we're being groomed for generations to be very left wing through all our various institutions, I do think that your average Joe spots the extremist, the true extremist, when he sees him. And I know that from this last general election, talking to a lot of friends, family back home, and they were absolutely able to distinguish between the Irish Freedom Party, say, and some other parties. Now, they wouldn't vote for him because they bought, the smears of the national media of the far right. It was still taboo, but they could actually distinguish very often between, because I don't know why nationalists seem to think that when you use the term nationalist, that all the rules of political science disappear.
That's right. Well, it is hopeful that the numbers of street protests are now growing again, but we have been here before in 2020 with the various marches that happened then. However, it seems to me that that's one aspect only. That there's another aspect, which is, and this requires a number of things to be kind of fixed. And they're not within the power or gift of any of us, but this is kind of what we need to think about. I mean, essentially, that kind of what we need to be able to do is create a situation where people can turn on their television sets at 9:30 on a Tuesday or Wednesday night and hear people talking about ideas like this.
Yes.
About the future of Ireland.
Yes.
And talking about it from it. Now, that's a long way to go.
Yeah.
But we need to be providing the voices that will be available to do that, and we're not.
Yeah.
And then the secondary problem then, and it is by far the greater problem, is getting rid of the corrupt media and getting RTE cleaned out and put in decent journalists and editors and managers into the place. But
you're right, though. You're right. There is just the propaganda wall. You have to first get around it, but then when you do get around it, you have to have substance. Yeah.
Yes, and not just substance, but you need people not to be saying absolutely crazy stuff. They need to be saying things that are meaningful and will connect with people emotionally and reasonably. And that's not available right now. And it's not there. And on the platforms that I see, it's not there. And so we're a long way from the starting gate, never mind the finishing line.
John, I'm an old man. I can't keep up with you, so we'll wrap this up soon. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on one thing before we do. I know that, obviously you're a religious man, and it's another great interest of yours. What's your take on the big event of the week, the new and the first American Pope?
Well, actually, I started off being very pessimistic from the earlier reports. I didn't know much about him. I didn't know anything about him, but I was kind of listen to Taylor Marshall, and it sounded like he was Francis 2.0. But then he emerged onto the balcony with the vestments and saying the prayers, the Confiteor, and the blessing, and so on, and the Hail Mary. It seemed to be, some kind of gesture. So I was vacillating, and I listened to Michael Matt, who's from the Remnant newspaper, and he's a really solid, alternative Catholic commentator. He's not mainstream at all, and he's really direct and straight and all that, but I was thinking about it again, and I was thinking about the name, and something was in my head about this name. Leo the 14th. Leo the 13th was really a remarkable pope. Conservative, yes, but I mean that he reigned in the late 19th century, so everybody was conservative. These things didn't really rise in the same way. But it's only today that it struck me what the real thing about Leo the 13th that nobody's kind of picked up on yet, and that is that his most famous encyclical is called Rerum Novarum, which means revolution, something like revolution of change, and it's about revolutionary change. The subtitle is Rights and Duties of Capital and Labour, and that was in 1891 that was published, and it was kind of like. We were talking about earlier, and you were saying that, you got it exactly right, that it was kind of like seeking to find a midway between Marx and capitalism, so that the church's social teaching would kind of deal with issues to do with work, not just money, not just income, but the sanctity of work and the expressiveness of work, so the creativity of work and the importance of work in the human spirit, And there's a kind of a continuity on this issue, because in 1981, Pope John Paul II did another encyclical, very related, as a kind of a tribute on the 90th anniversary to Leo the 13th, which is called Laborum Exercens, on human work. Now, it seems to me that this is the most pressing issue probably facing humanity in the coming time, is because we're already nearly, the game is almost over in a certain sense, because we've sold the past. The past has been sold from under us, really, on the question of AI and human work and human control. The democratic control over these instruments, it's gone. It's Silicon Valley controls everything, and nobody seems to be even talking about that. And it seems to me that this may be the territory that Leo XIV is will be most focused on. I hope so. I think it could be very interesting, like, because it's. This is something there's very much a theme in my book, actually, in the abolition of reality, is about how this happened, that we lost control. Because I remember when I was editor of In Dublin back in 1985, and later on in McGill, a huge theme in those years was the future of work, and the obsolescence of the human and the machines taking over, and then that all disappeared. It disappeared in the 90s because the world started getting prosperous. We had all these booms, the post-Reagan boom, and then that spread to Europe, and then eventually we had the Celtic Tiger. And we forgot about it, and nobody talked about it until about 5 or 6 years ago. It started up again, and all these guys came onto the steps of Silicon Valley and said, well, it's okay, we sorted it all out now. You don't need to worry your pretty little heads anymore about this. We're dealing with it, and here's the deal. Now shut up and listen. And that was the offer. So it seems to me that issue is the most pressing, is to reopen the democratic box and put this back into it. And I suspect that the new Pope may be focused on this. I hope I'm right. It's an intuition. I haven't heard anybody else say it, but it's just an intuition I have. I think in general, about him, he was supposedly as a conservative in the Benedict years. And then he was very much a Francophile. He was appointed a cardinal by Pope Francis in 2003. He has some conservative views. I'm not arguing for conservatism, by the way, or traditionalism in that sense. I think they're kind of fascists. It's about, it's a bit like what we've been talking about, like ethno-nationalism. No, can we talk about reality?
Yes, right.
And beings and their lives and what is called for, and maybe even create a whole new language that isn't theological or dogmatic or doctrinal or whatever. So maybe he will be that guy. Maybe he will. There are some signs. There are some signs that he might be. I think, and even Taylor Marshall now is reviewing his initial skepticism, and he's saying let's give him a chance. And I think that's certainly something that Michael Matt says, it could have been worse, straight off. And,
yes.
And, that's sure. But the one thing is for certain, the world, like this guy is 60, he's actually younger than me. He's the first Pope in my lifetime who was actually younger than me.
He's 69, right?
69. I'm 69 too, but he is 3 months on me.
You're getting old, John.
You're only a young fella. Come on.
Why do you think I only interview lads who were born in the 50s? That's the whole point of my channel. I only how I talk to yourself, and
well, but the world can't afford a second Francis.
No,
not the church, but the world. Because the influence this guy on, I won't go into a lot of dark stuff in relation to like McCarrick and CIA connections and all that kind of stuff. But it's all about mass migration, in my view. It's down to that issue.
Yes, that's right. He aligned perfectly with that's what my whole thing about it was that my view on any pope, I'm not going to get into. I stayed out of any talk about it because look, I'm not literate enough in it. But also the thing is that if you're a practicing Catholic, you believe that the Pope was, he comes from above. He was chosen by God. So there you go. There's that. Take that element out of it. There's a liturgical which you're going to go along with no matter what. If you're practicing, you might grumble, but he's your Pope. But then there's the political element, and that's fair game. I'm not going to argue with anything on terms of liturgy or whatnot because that's church business. But every Pope has a worldly influence also, and the great ones do it quietly, or they try to limit it. But then if he is a vocally political pope, well, then it's absolutely fair game to say, well, hang on, or to analyze that.
Well, just to clarify, there's one aspect of that. The foundational point was slightly off there, I think.
Okay.
Because it's not the case that God chooses the pope. The cardinals have free will.
Okay.
The way it goes, I mean, there is a joke, about which is attributed to Pope Benedict when he was interviewed by a journalist in the interregnum.
Now you see why I stayed out of the conversation.
In the interregnum between his resignation, which wasn't a resignation, and the new appointment of a new pope, he was asked by a journalist in an interview, what did he think about what would happen, and he said like that. Well, the Holy Spirit really, chooses the Pope. He says, and the Holy Spirit only occasionally makes a mistake.
Okay, there you go.
But what to translate that?
Well, actually, but it is an important distinction. I mean, then it is.
Yeah, the Holy Spirit, let's say, will try to influence. But if these guys are politicized and determined ideologically to go a certain way, and remember that Francis stuffed the College of Cardinals with 108 cardinals. That's the unbelievable number. Yeah. And there were only 27 or 28 of the previous kind up to 2013 left. Now, there's all kinds of stories on which I've gone into in my Substack a little bit in the last few days, which is essentially that Pope Benedict never resigned, and that essentially there was a coup. He was removed from the ministry, but not the office, and he was held a prisoner in the Vatican for the next 10 years. That's the story, which I think is well founded now. But he said
for political reasons, like he was too conservative, or?
Well, you see, a lie to that is another narrative which says that the CIA took a deep interest in this, and that Theodore McCarrick, that appalling paedophile cardinal, ex-cardinal, he was their bagman, going around the world buying up votes, buying up support for Bergoglio. And that's how Bergoglio came to be Pope. Okay,
so it's just as earthly as any other institution.
Oh, yeah, well, that's. I think it has become. Maybe it always was. I think one of the things I'm finding out about myself is that I've been very naive about a lot of things, and so I was about to say there that certainly in recent times, but probably always, human nature doesn't change that much.
I don't think so. I'm the same. I'm skeptical enough to think that and like I say, I won't criticize things that I don't, as you pointed out brilliantly, and that on matters of religion, I'm no expert, and I'll leave them to the people who know what they're talking about to do that. But on issues of politics, that I think, and I would encourage anyone to wade in, where they, I don't. When the Pope is king of the spiritual realm, but when he steps into the political realm, actually, it was Jack Posobiec who said it brilliantly. What did he say? He said that papal infallibility doesn't extend to politics.
Yes, well, on that related, broadening out that point you make there, just about the whole point of what we're doing here, talking. That's the point of it. It's the point of it is not being right about everything. You know what I mean? I've never, I've been wrong about loads of stuff through the years, and sure. Some things I've been right about, and maybe some more things I hope I'll be right about in time. But it's a kind of a process. Like I'm learning from you. You're learning from me. We're interacting. We're adjusting our outputs based on new information or whatever. Right. And that's the process, and that's been the greatest assault on our democracy, was taking that away. Yeah. That doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't happen. The media is not doing that. Yeah. It's doing some, and the greatest crime the media is committing is that it's pretending it's still doing that when it's not.
I fully agree with you on that. Well, like I use you as the example often when I'm talking to people. How many John Waters are there as columnists anymore in any Irish publication. It doesn't exist. It's all very bland and all very safe and all very blah, and riddled with the DEI hires. But even the ones that aren't, they're still not going to bite the hand that feeds them. That, like I said, the media's in the pocket of the government in a very real way. Not in this is all very clearly laid out that they can't. That what's it? There's Bauer, who do the audio media. There's Media Huis, who does the independent Belfast Telegraph, and a bunch of others. There's the Irish Times, who has that, and the Examiner. There's really three conglomerates that control the vast majority of the media in Ireland, and they can't exist without government interventions.
And then you look at the context of journalism, the profession of journalism, which used to be a very much exalted profession with its conventions and its principles and its code of conduct and so on. That's all.
But that's what I mean about you. I don't mean just that you had opinions and wrote columns that were outside of the orthodox. It was more that you brought gravitas. You're a guy who has you're a guy who's capable of doing this. Your average journalist isn't capable of that anymore.
Well, see, and related to that is this as well, that many of the journalists now, you have all these colleges turn them out by the new time, but all to the same model. They're like sausages now, They're just coming off the production line. They have the same views about everything, and that's exactly what they want. And they go into the media, and the payment, the salaries and wages have gone way down for journalists.
That's right, yeah.
And the freelance rates are gone way down. So now there's a battle every day for survival, and anybody who doesn't toe the line, they're gone.
Yeah.
So what you actually encountered in young people who are journalists is that they might well know the truth, but there's no money in speaking it, and there's no money in pretending. It doesn't butter parsnips to tell people that you know what the truth is, because the more it might get out that you're talking behind people's backs and that you're wide to what's happening. No. So these guys, their ideology and their motivation in respect of their incomes, etc., are tied together intrinsically. They're inextricably linked, and that's a formidable force in journalism now, what is called journalism, and that's kind of maintaining the pseudo-reality, which is essentially, as I keep saying to people, it's almost like every night when you're going to sleep, all these stage hands and attendants go onto the streets and they rearrange everything, metaphysically and otherwise, so that when you wake up in the morning, what confronts you in the world is a false reality again, but it's slightly subtly changed from yesterday. So it looks like it's a real reality. It's moving all the time. It's changing all the time. But it's being changed by changing words, language, sentences, paragraphs, pictures, images, memes, slogans, smears. All these things are being used to create a false reality every night so that it can be consumed during the day. And that's why people actually... there's a kind of a puzzle that people have, and I often puzzle about this. Do people really not know, or are they pretending not to know? There's a Chinese proverb about thinking about that, that the hardest people to convince are people who already know. But I think that something like that. But I think actually that the pseudo reality is comforting because it's not complicated.
Yes.
It's a simple. You know where you stand. You know what you need to do. If you deviate from that, you're on your own. And nobody wants to be on their own in this situation, or very few are prepared to stand alone and stand up against this tyranny.
John, I think that's a perfect place to wrap that up, because I think for leaving it on that thought, as you said, this isn't a book about COVID. This, I think, is more akin to what you just explained to us right there. This is your new book, The Abolition of Reality, it's looking at these deeper meanings that underpin how could this happen and how has our world changed since COVID.
Yes, that's exactly it.
John, thanks a million for coming on and giving us so much time. I know people are going to really enjoy this. I'm going to put a link to the book in the description to this video as well on YouTube, and when I share it on X. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a million, Owen. Much obliged to you.